Trust you. I'm gonna.
Know what I'm saying? Stop playing. Good, Shelly, yo. Stop playing. Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
All right, welcome to the Black Men's Podcast. Welcome to the Black Men's Podcast. Your host, Too Black. I am here with Cam today. The rest of the fam is still on vacation. What's up, Cam?
Hey, y'all.
We are joined today by a not so special guest. All of us go way back, but his name is Taharka Anderson. I'm gonna allow him to introduce himself, and then we'll get into what the discussion is for today.
Like brother Blackity Black said, my name is Taharka Anderson. I'm from Long Beach, California. I'm currently the research and curriculum development specialist with the African Black Coalition. I'm the founder of Your Neighborhood Scholar, where we center neighborhood narratives, research, and resources to advance justice in Black communities. And lastly, I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, where I look at the social vulnerabilities of Black males, as well as Black students in school discipline. And I'm excited to be here.
All right, so you be learning shit. That's what's up.
Yeah, just a little bit, you feel me?
A little bit.
We're not excited. We forced him to be here. Otherwise, we told him we wouldn't be friends with him no more.
Well, y'all could have sent me $5 for breakfast, something. Like,
Nah.
We have a whole invite to my house in a month where you will be fed for the whole weekend.
You're not invited anywhere where I'm at, but still no. All right, so today we talked about this, by the way, on our in the last episode, which was interesting. It was an interesting experience considering we had to kind of throw it together on the fly, not because of our faults, but just things that went down with scheduling and things of that nature. We weren't able to have our originally scheduled program, but thank you for everybody who bared through that, and hopefully you still learned something within the conversation we were able to have about community control of police and police abolition. I think there were some good points made, and there's also an opportunity to have more conversation, hopefully in the near future. But we will be continuing the debate series, but not every month because it's just a lot to plan. But we'll let y'all know when it's coming. But for today, we said at the end of the last episode, at least in the live stream, we said that we were going to discuss our methodology as far as how we do myths. And just to be frank, like we often get people, not often, but every once in a while, people hit us up and ask us to do a myth. And, I don't think we've never fully explained how we arrive at our conclusions. So I don't necessarily blame people, but sometimes we just get some really interesting and silly requests. So it could be like, why don't y'all talk about, like, one time somebody was like, why don't y'all need to talk about why the N-word isn't really a term of endearment, and I was just like, that's an opinion. That's not a myth, because some people think calling each other niggas isn't a term of endearment. Some Black people don't. There's no way to quantify whether that's true or false. That's an opinion, and we don't do opinions. That's not what we consider to be myths. So we want to clarify those things. So if you want to submit, because we do want to be open to community, if you want to submit, you kind of have an idea of how we arrive at our position, and then also just give you a better sense of how people research things, and how there's methodologies and there's a way, and nothing is really neutral. Honestly, everybody has a particular persuasion or an objective that they're attempting to achieve, and your only thing you really can do is try to have a consistent way of doing that. So we're going to go over that today. Cam, did you want to talk about UFOs and those requests? Or
Yeah, I think it's just really important to first acknowledge what a myth is, right? A myth is a widely held but false belief or idea. It's not just me saying that, I don't like snapbacks, I prefer bucket hats, and telling everybody and their mama, and then I get a whole squad of people who agree with me. Like, that's not a myth, that's just an opinion. And so, saying that Egyptians were aliens who built the pyramids, like, that's not widely held. That's just a small group of weird people on the internet and on Reddit talking about it. And so this episode was something that was just really important for us to sit and talk about, why we do this work, like, and not just why, but like how we actually do it, and how we aim to debunk the bullshit that's said about Black people in a way that makes sense, that actually pushes our people further, and not just go back and forth about topics that could be debated on Twitter.
Yeah. So we're gonna give you a little brief breakdown of our philosophy, and we're gonna get deeper into the methodology. But Cameron's right. Myths aren't just whatever you say they are. Let's get to this philosophy, and then we'll and Taharka, feel free to jump in. He's here as our PhD nigga to chin check us if our methodology is flawed, since he's constantly in the process of doing this. And he has a lot to say about how people arrive at their conclusions, particularly about Black men and Black males.
He had a lot to say about everything.
Yeah.
So.
All right. All right, so when someone asks us to describe the Black Myths Podcast, the reply is usually what Cameron just said, something to the effect that we debunk myths, i.e. the bullshit said about Black people. This explanation is primarily meant to be simple and to the point so people can get it, but we got time today. So we want to explore the philosophy and methodology behind this phrase while still keeping it to the point. So when we say bullshit, we mean irrational ideas and concepts that ultimately become myths about and or related to Black African people. But ideas don't appear out of nowhere. They arrive through a process. If you have the idea to go grocery shopping, you are likely either hungry, out of food, or you just like buying random shit for recipes like Cam does. Either way, the idea is inspired by pre-existing conditions, as in something led to Cameron going shopping. She had to make an observation. She did not just do this out of the blue. It didn't just happen. Ideas are formed by an analysis about the material world and or by pre-existing phenomena. You are labeled as Black or brown or white because the idea of race was socially and politically instituted into this society. In a class society, ideas do not operate neutrally. Societies are organized around a certain logic, a set of ideas to produce a general outcome. In America, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism are the main organizing ideas of society. Oppression becomes the outcome. In order to continue organizing society around oppression, the ideas of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism need to be enforced, and it is through this process that myths are formed. The logic of this society produces bullshit, and myths become propaganda that upholds it. The myth of capitalism is based on hard work and individual freedom. Therefore, poor people must be lazy and undisciplined. The myth of white supremacy is based on racial superiority and Eurocentricity. So Black people must be culturally backwards and should behave more like white people to become quote unquote equal in society. The myth of patriarchy is based on masculine domination. So since women, queer folk, and outgroup men, I got you, Taharka, are weak and infantile, they should be ruled and eliminated. Each idea produces a guiding logic that serves as a rationale on how people should think and behave. The Black Myths Podcast seeks to disrupt these forms of logic and rationalization. We understand that myths are socially produced ideas, not simply bullshit in people's heads. Myths are learned. They become so perpetually normalized that we think we can explain nature through these myths. They're so pervasive that even when we're looking for answers, they funnel us back to bullshit. The Willy Lynch letter is a great example. It claims to explain the makings of a slave by drastically oversimplifying the slave experience and the history that produced it. It then tries to reduce all Black people's historical and contemporary problems down to one random meeting of plantation owners who formed a pact to control Black people for 400 years, like an intro to a bad Jordan Peele movie. Or I should just say a Jordan Peele movie. The letter discourages further historical analysis and perpetuates patriarchal myths of Black women while claiming to offer an explanation to our conditions. But this letter only received the support it got because society is organized around bullshit. A society organized around a different set of principles and ideas would never take this letter seriously, nor would it have a history of slavery to hide in the first place. In closing, we as a podcast recognize the ideas we as people employ to explain our reality are important. Bullshit ideas only furthers our oppression. Myths are the propaganda that makes oppression seem rational. We believe transforming the way we analyze the society is imperative to removing it and constructing a better one. Each myth is debunked with this understanding. This show is not a trivia or Black Jeopardy. So when we say we debunk the bullshit about Black people, we are not being abstract. The bullshit must go for us to be free. This podcast is our contribution towards that goal. Thank you.
Wow, look I done taught you well, son. This is good.
God. Anyway,
I also would just like to state that Two Black slander against Jordan Peele movies is an opinion of his own. Y'all do not fucking flood our comments saying that our whole podcast is some fucking Jordan Peele haters. Just let that be in Two Black mentions.
you know, I didn't label it as a myth, but you know, but it's a good intro. It's a distinguishing between opinions and things that could be quantified as actual truly or false. So I'm gonna kick it to Cam to talk about but specifically our methodology and just kind of how we label myths and how we arrive at that. But again, just remember what we were said. We do this just to kind of summarize it one more time. We do this not with just this idea of this is true or false in a vacuum. Like, we understand that this is connected to an entire process, a dialectical process that produces bullshit, and you have to disrupt that in order to create a different pathway. That's just how this works. So,
and speaking of bullshit, like directly diving into just our methodology of first, how do we identify a myth? We're thinking like, does this myth harm Black people, right? Like, it's not just things that are said. It is, what is the impact of this? What is the impact of this on Black people psychologically, mentally, emotionally, economically? How does this impact folks politically? And how does this also direct the ways in which white people continue to just ruin our lives? And also just like, does this myth indict us individuals instead of systems? So when we talk about like an opinion, is that going to actually harm people in the masses, or is this just, and if I'm like, Too Black is not shit, that's not a myth. That's
a fact.
That is not a myth, but it is just a simple fact, right? And it is not just attacking the whole. It does not address any of it, and it is not something that widespreadly would be causing mass harm. And we then think like through, what are the policies and the choices by the power that are behind this myth, right? What is the intent behind this myth being perpetuated? Even when we think of the bullshit like the Willy Lynch letter, what was the intent behind folks wanting this to be something real? Folks wanted Black folks to think that, like, and white folks and everybody else to think that the Willy Lynch letter was something that was just huge, that the white powers that be at the time just were so fucking well weaved together that they were sending each other letters across with these very specific and articulate methods to keep Black folks enslaved. And that's just not true, because
in a time where it took weeks to receive a letter,
if that shit even made it.
In a time where it took months to years to even get from one place to another, you want us to believe that everybody came to one location to hear a speech that was probably 20 minutes long, and then they went home. There's no record logs of hotels. There's no travel logs. There's no journals. There's no diaries. There's no information to prove this meeting ever happened. But yeah, sorry, that one always obviously gets under my skin.
That one cuts deep. You know, and then like, what are the other adverse effects that are that come from a myth? So we dove into Black Don't Crack, and I think while, you know, we do age like fine wine,
all of us,
you know, while some other folks age like milk, that is a myth that, while can be really empowering, has also really caused a lot of harm, because in a lot of ways it has folks neglecting health, neglecting the very real things that impact Black folks. Niggas think they don't need to wear sunscreen, and that just blows me. I'm like, what are you talking about? Put some sunscreen on. Public service announcement, y'all. Put some sunscreen on. If I Black girl, sunscreen, put it on. I don't care.
My melanin, it allows me to absorb the cosmic rays, sister.
Fuck that. Climate change is real.
We gotta
666 carbon is gonna allow me to transmute all of it.
This the bullshit we be debunking.
Yeah, and we have a whole episode a long time ago that was very funny on that very specific topic of melanin being a superpower. So Taharka's reaching into the archives with that one. But yeah, I mean, and it also is not just Black people individually, right? But like doctors, health insurers follow the same idea that Black don't crack. And I said that on that episode, like on one side you have Black people who might believe it's some superpower that they, or some like superiority of melanin. But then on the other side, you have doctors and healthcare practitioners who believe because Black people don't feel pain, we don't have to treat them, right? Yeah. Because Black people don't experience the same amount of horror when they're in the sun for 12 hours, right? Like that was the logic of slavery. Like we can just leave them out there forever and they can just keep working and they're not going to drop dead even though they did. So this logic again it keeps the system going. Yeah.
Really quick, I think that's an interesting point you bring up. In my first semester of my PhD program, I took a race and medicine class. And every week we went over a myth that is that either existed or currently exists within the medical industry about Black people, right? So one of the myths, and it was interesting to see how some of the things that I've heard said in some Black communities or sometimes in nationalist oriented spaces or spaces where, we're trying to lift ourselves up and speak highly of ourselves. It's sometimes interesting to see how some of the times when like we have these narratives that Black people are built different or are like literally a different kind of human being. And while that may seem like a quote unquote advantage on one end, when I was going through this class and there's like doctors and studies where people believe Black people's blood coagulates or clots faster, or believe that, historically, there were scientists who said that Black people's muscles were like stronger or more sturdy, right? Or that even today, Black people are given less pain medication because different medical practitioners today actually believe that we can endure more pain than other individuals. Yes. So like, I think about some of those things I hear and I read in medical journals, and then I think about Black people saying that, some Black people saying that, we need to discipline our kids differently than white children, right? Oh, they're able to just go to timeout and get talked to, but I need to beat my kids, or I need to, physically discipline my kids, or corporal punishment, because, different kids just need a certain type of discipline, or, I turned out fine, or they turned out fine, or my kids or our children can handle these things. So I just think about how in various circles, not only white people, right, but also in Black communities, as a result of sometimes internalizing some of these beliefs that we are a different kind of human being, perpetuate and cycle these narratives that we're different, right? Or that we're naturally better at sports, right? Black people say this and white people say this, but it has a different outcome if white people are saying that, yeah, y'all niggas run faster, jump higher, and have this superhuman, capability. Then you get people like, who was it? Darren Wilson that said, when Mike Brown had his hands on me, I felt like it was like Hulk Hogan holding on to a baby.
And it was a demon. He said he felt like he was looking at a demon. That was what Darren Wilson. Yes, yeah.
Right. So I think we sometimes need to be careful about when we endorse myths that our bodies or our genetics or we survive slavery because our bodies are built differently or genetically or chemically different than white people, I think we need to further interrogate what does that really mean and what are the potential negative outcomes if white people endorse those very same ideologies about Black people being a different kind of human.
So Cam said the material impact. So there's like 3 qualifiers for every myth. There's the material impact, which is just like Cam already said, we identify like in seeking to identify a myth. We are interested in if the myth has any material impact on Black people. So I always use the example of back in the day, there was a rumor that Beyonce was faking her pregnancy. This was a stupid rumor, but even if the rumor was true, it has no material impact on Black people. So even if Beyonce, which she was not, but even if she was faking her pregnancy, it does not matter. Your life will not change whether you believe that or not. There's no real principle to act on that to go oppress anybody. It's just a thing that people saying. So we don't, it has that material impact on it, such as the stuff we were talking about with Black women, you know, where we think Black people don't feel pain. That has real material impact on Black people, right? So something that's quantifiable, you know, we were talking about Black Wall Street, something that's quantifiable when our myth was Black Wall Street was self-sustaining, quantifiable as in you can actually measure it and define it. And it's something we have some level of universality to understand whether it's true or false. So when you say self-sustaining, which was a claim of Black Wall Street, self-sustaining is a very particular way of defining it, is to say that the community can exist by itself without any outside help. When we actually investigated it, we found that most of Black people in Black Wall Street worked for white employers, and therefore it was actually their money and labor that was funding Black Wall Street, even within the small district that it existed. That is not self-sustaining by any stretch, by any definition, whether it's loosely defined or, you know, hardly defined. It's just not, that's not what self-sustaining is. So it has to be quantifiable. That's why we say it can't be opinions, because opinions are not quantifiable. Even if your opinion is fair, it's not something we can quantify yeah or nay. That's why we have a new series for debates, because there are some things that even if I think what you're saying is ridiculous, you still might have a point. I just don't agree with you. That's not a quantifiable thing as far as we can say it's true or false. Popularity, the last one is whether it's popular or it's widespread. So it means that it's something that Cameron got at this earlier as well. Like it's something that you know, is believed across the population, or it's perpetuated on mainstream platforms that has major exposure to populations. It's not, yo, I heard Black people are on Saturn. That's just some random shit you heard in a bad YouTube video. Nobody really believes that. Most people you say it to would laugh you in the face, as they should, because it's not a real thing, right? But if you think that you know, there are plenty of people that really do believe that Black people are superhuman and just do feel less pain, and that does have material impact. So all of these, all of our qualifiers intersect. A lot of this stuff has to be happening at the same time. So whenever we choose a myth, you know, we vet, does the myth reach this standard? If it does not reach this standard, we do not do it. There was actually once upon a time, just to give a quick story, I had the idea that I was going to say that the myth was that Pan-Africanism and Hotep had become synonymous, whatever we understand to be Hotep. But I realized that I could not find a quantifiable definition of Hotep. It was a very amorphous definition that switched with whoever you talk to. So I wasn't going to be able to say that people have actually, as a large, widespread, popular force, said that Pan-Africanism and Hotep is the same thing. We could not prove it. I couldn't find any source that verifies. So even though I look on Twitter and it's my opinion that a lot of people have confused whatever they think Hotep is with Pan-Africanism, I could not prove that definitively that that was a myth. So we were not able to do that as an episode because there was no, like, it didn't meet the standard or that we hold as a show. Like that's just give a concrete example, like how we arrive at stuff. So anything we come up with runs through this mill. Sometimes, you know, things rise a little higher on the scale. Sometimes things aren't as popular, but they're popular enough to talk about. Some things, you know, usually quantifiable is the most, we hold that one the hardest. Some things have more of a material impact than others, but it has some level of material impact. some level of quantify. It can be measured on some level and has some level of popularity, or it's widespread. Just to give people like that's our clear like methodology of how we schedule our myths. If it does not reach that standard, we don't do it.
So we are not going to be ever having an episode on some stupid shit like Black men not shit, because that one is not quantifiable. There's very little material impact outside of the ones that are idiots who believe that to begin with. And so just stop asking us, because it's not going to happen. If I see another DM asking for this episode, I'm gonna just start blasting names. No, I would not do that. That's disrespectful. But I am very annoyed with the amount of people that are asking us to do such a slanderous and claim. And I will bring Taharka on specifically because if any of y'all follow him, you know he is not the one to ever step to try to slander Black men.
Yeah, that will fly. And also, what I know, we don't touch a lot of relationship stuff because hardly ever does it meet any of the standards we just named. It's usually just opinions. It hardly ever meets any. It's never quantifiable. It's always overgeneralized about a population. Whether it's about, and when I say gender things, all things are gendered. I do want to clarify that, but I'm talking about gender in a very specific way. When we're talking about relationships and stuff like that, we don't deal with it because it's rarely ever quantifiable at all. Like if you say Black men ain't shit, that is an opinion. Whether I agree with it or not, that is an opinion. You'd have to define what ain't shit even means first to even advance that. And then that whatever you define as ain't shit, is there going to be any universality around that definition, or is there just going to be you and your people, right? And then it's just going to cause and another reason why stuff like that doesn't work. That's why you see so much vitriol online, because there is no agreed upon definition. So everybody's angry on their own way of defining it. There's nothing that's agreeable to move forward on. Like, okay, we all understand this is the subject, and then I'm going to say what I have to say from my side. It's no, this is the definition. So often people are just arguing about what it means to them. They're never even getting to the heart of what the matter actually is. So it's not to say that there's not a way to have conversations about those things, but just you have to frame things in a particular type of way. If you don't, it messes it up. And there was a feminist to Harker's, joy, but it was in a book, Invention of Women. Great book. I would recommend people read it. But she was quoted Kathy Ferguson in this book. She says, talking about framing. The questions we can ask about the world are enabled and other questions disabled by the frame that orders the questioning. When we are busy arguing about the questions that appear within a certain frame, the frame itself becomes invisible. We become enframed within it, right? So I really just think about that. Sometimes the way things are framed produce a particular outcome, and we don't even realize that we're caught up within a framework that might be flawed, that might be just leading people to constant dysfunction because the framework itself is fucked up. And that's what we're saying at the beginning with our philosophy. We recognize that ideas are produced in a process out of society by choices that are made and based on observation. So ideas don't come out of nowhere. Ideas are produced by a certain society that has certain tendencies. And in this society, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, etc., that is a society that is constantly reproducing itself. So of course, the ideas that come from it are going to reflect the society that it's from, right? Like that's just scientific. So we have to have that understanding when we talk about these things, because if not, we often find ourselves in conversations that are reductive, useless, because we're not realizing the framework that we're operating within.
It's important for us to continue to drive the information forward and to introduce these things to folks so we can start rethinking collectively. There are so many times that we've gone into an episode brainstorm and we've been looking through research and been like, damn, I didn't even know this. I thought I knew a little bit, and now my mindset is being challenged, or an opinion that I've already had, but after doing some of the work, being like, whew, I actually needed to shift perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. To do with other folks.
That's a good point, because like I know we used to say, we don't really say it anymore. We used to say it, during the first season of Fresh Prince. We used to say that We used to say that, you know, we're not the experts, we just quote them. So, you know, as in we really be learning as we go. Like this is not, we are like all knowing and we know everything. And then we just decided to share what we know with y'all. Like we actually be learning as we go, like straight up. So the stuff I learned about melanin, just to reference that episode, I didn't know all of that. We really get into the science of melanin. And when I say the science, I mean the actual science, not the science, but the actual, like, you know, data proof science of it. Or I mean, even when we just did one we just did a few months ago on Black Wall Street, I didn't know. I knew that this kind of Black capitalist narrative was BS, but I did not know, you know, that 95% of the people during that time living in substandard housing did not know that. Did not know the how I guess widespread the poverty was. I did not know, and which made it even worse that they bumped it up. Or I did not know that Black Wall Street is only really like 2 to 3 blocks of a neighborhood. You know, because they sell it to us like it's a whole city, and it actually wasn't. You know, I knew it wasn't as big as they told us to, but in the neighborhood, it's about 35 blocks. It's only about maybe 3 to 4 blocks of that neighborhood, or 2 to 3 blocks of the neighborhood. Did not know that. So, but
No, I knew that, you know, the Tulsa massacre wasn't just based on, you know, white people being pissed off that Black folks had a little bit of coin, but I didn't even know the extent to which the damage was, how gruesome it was, how many folks have not ever returned back, you know, and were permanently displaced. And so by doing that, we got a lot of slack. People thinking that we were just bashing Tulsa, but we said it then and we'll say it again. For me, there was so much more that I gained, and that so much more of an honor that I felt for those who have lived through it and that are still here, those who died in the Tulsa massacre, and the people that have come from them, you know, by knowing the truth of their story. It's
you appreciate it more, actually.
yeah, like it's more palatable to understand, like, okay, well, of course white folks didn't want Black people to have money back then. It was pissed off and envious, and so they did what they always do when they see Black people get up. They wanted to destroy it. It's so much more palatable to think about that, but to know the story that Black folks were advocating for one another, that they were standing up with weapons and were very much willing to die in order to protect each other.
Protect the Black boy from being lynched.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, now it was about protecting community, not protecting business. And the businesses that were lost and the wealth that was lost, while massive and had generational impacts, is not, at least for me personally, was not as impactful as understanding the ways in which Black people have always showed up for community first, and will always protect community first, and against any and everything that will come against us. And so I think that for me was more important to honor and debunk that myth than just letting folks continue to believe that this was about capitalism.
Yeah, it's a Black utopia.
Yeah. I think sometimes for the sake of boosting morale amongst our community, we are very adamant about some of our beliefs. But I think ultimately, in terms of us thinking about organizing very meticulously, or understanding the various manifestations of white supremacy and like different forms of oppression, I think when we recover a more expansive understanding of history sometimes and let go of some of the myths, we arrive at a more concrete potential solution. Or even even if it's not a solution, we're able to develop ways to like respond or organize that are potentially more effective. So it's not just, support Black business. No, is if we're going to support institutions, we have to think about who's going to own them, who's going to control them, right? Who gets to determine what happens to the profits, right? So I think, you know, some of the myths may make us feel good sometimes, but ultimately, if we're really going to be serious about organizing or liberation, it's always, from what I've seen, a lot more complicated than the very reductionist, simplified understandings that we sometimes have about history that make us feel good. But I wholeheartedly understand why you would want to, sort of feel good after being told you ain't shit, y'all ain't built no institutions,
Right.
People don't control everything, you ain't never had no community. And it's like, once you hear we did have a community, we have businesses, we were circulating the dollar, it makes you feel good. And that is true.
Yeah.
A lot of people are still poor, right? So what does it look like to lean into, in terms of like Black Wall Street, what does it look like to lean into the precarity of what many of those Black people were still living under and still trying to chart a path to freedom, even though all of them weren't doing good, or all of them weren't wealthy, or all of them didn't own a business? And then how does that inform even the way we think about whether it's Black business, Black entrepreneurship, or, Black economics today? So I think, it's great to feel good, but we don't, organizing and the liberation of Black people is not about recovering shit just so we could feel good, right?
Right.
It's that we can develop a more effective and meticulous strategies to chart, a way forward for freedom and liberation. And sometimes that shit ain't gonna feel good. Sometimes you're gonna hear, nah, y'all niggas wasn't just rich and wealthy and in swimming pools and jacuzzis. Like, a lot of people
We're not all kings and queens. Some of us were fucking farmers.
right.
Most of us weren't kings and queens. And I don't know why anybody wants to be a king and queen anyway, because that's inherently oppressive, honestly. But
but I think that's another one of those things that made us feel good. For example, my name is Taharka, right? I was named after an ancient Egyptian pharaoh from the 25th dynasty. And growing up as a Black boy, and you receive all these negative messages from society, it felt good knowing I was named after an Egyptian pharaoh, right? Is that gonna free me? No. Did it make me feel, did it make me feel good growing up? Yes. Am I gonna tell other Black people the solution to our problems is just to put on dashikis and take on a new name? Absolutely not. So I think there's nuance in all of it. And I think what you all do through unpacking myths is you're still open to understanding why Black people endorse some of these myths.
That's essentially like our the end of our kind of methodology. We want to get more into like the epistemology, which we were kind of already talking about, as far as like how we come to know things, right? And Taharka, I know you as a researcher, and whether that was in school or even dealing with organizations, I know sometimes you're confronted with these questions as far as like, how do people come to even know what they know? And you like to go in on people on IG about this a lot, but like in all seriousness, like if I'm like like we just explain our epistemology, essentially this is how we arrive at our conclusions, fair or not, you can agree with it or not, but at least you know why, and then you can grade it on that scale. But I'm saying for you, if somebody is just like like for instance, Black men ain't shit or whatever, how do you even like begin to even like unpack that?
I mean, for me, when I've seen people make particular comments about Black men, usually number one, we have to, as you said before, we have to define the terms, right? So Black men ain't shit. For the times I've had exchanges with people about that, or seen it in academic texts by people such as Bell Hooks and We Real Cool, Black Men and Masculinity, the question becomes, so if we identify a set of behaviors, right, that Black men engage in, and then we say as a result of them engaging in these kind of harmful behaviors in our community, that makes them ain't shit. But then you don't provide any evidence that covers when any other segment of the Black community engages in this very same behavior. I know you're cherry picking information now, right? So it's like when people come to me and because my position has never been that Black men don't perpetuate harm within the Black community. But then when people come to me with their so-called evidence or their anecdotal stories and things about Black men perpetrating harm, I say, well, I've also heard stories of Black women perpetrating these same kinds of harms. Or I say, there's also empirical evidence that shows that some Black women engage in intimate partner violence, that some Black women, sexually abuse individuals, right? That some Black women do harm children, right? Or that some Black women neglect children just as Black men do, right? But sometimes when people are so hell bent on or committed to their myth or their belief, right, of Black men not being shit, they're unwilling to even entertain other evidence that shows things to the contrary, right? So usually what I do is when people say those things, I ask them, what is the source of your information? Sometimes people will give me stories about themselves being personally harmed, or stories about their homegirls being harmed. And while that's valid, we then get into a conversation around, can those individual stories be used to generalize an entire population of Black men? And then if they do tell me, yes, it is valid because of me and my homegirls went through this, I then ask them, well, then would it be acceptable for a group of Black men who have been hurt by women and, older girls in their lives, if then they take those anecdotal and singular stories and then generalize an entire population of Black women, is that then valid as well, right? Then we come into cognitive dissonance, or people no longer want to allow that people no longer want to allow anecdotal evidence or singular stories to be valid in terms of advancing a narrative about entire populations. So when people, so when people ask those things, but I want to be clear that the majority of Black people and Black women that I've ran into do not have this belief that Black men are not shit, right? That Black men are, terrorists in our communities, that Black men are generally rapists, abusers, and criminals within the Black community. The majority of Black people that I know do not hold this belief. So the few times I have had these exchanges with individuals, I ask them what's their evidence. Usually it's personal stories or it's bell hooks. And then I ask them, well, what citations does bell hooks or anybody that you're referencing provide? And it's like, nobody, right? Yeah. It's like a memoir, or it's like Ice-T, right? Or it's like a rap song. And it's like, this cannot, we have to be, as various scholars say, if we're going to be discussing harms and what happens in our communities, we have to take our people serious, right? And if we're really concerned with harms and vulnerabilities within our communities, we have to, talk about these things in a very rigorous fashion. And back to what we were saying earlier, if we genuinely believe that, this is in terms of thinking about harms that happen in our communities, white people have said historically that Black people are genetically and biologically aggressive, prone to violence, neglectful of children, and sexually immoral and deviant, right? If we categorically reject those beliefs, right, that Black people are born or are innately or are genetically or biologically deviant, then that means whenever we see any kinds of harms happening in our communities, we have to begin investigating how does structural violence, right? How does poverty, how does lower levels of education, how does substance abuse, right? How does mental health, illnesses, how do all of these factors, influence what we see happening in our communities, as opposed to attempting to scapegoat or pretend as though there's a particular segment of our community that is the root cause of certain things. And in this example, the root cause that some people have arrived at is that the root cause is Black men, or Black men's toxic masculinity, or Black men's desire to be white men, which is just ahistorical and, empirically invalid.
Yeah, and I think just for the people listening, he just gave you like a breakdown of a whole example. He pretty much just did an episode within, within that whole breakdown.
about my shit sometimes, you feel me?
No, you good. I'm saying but I'm saying that's an example of what we're saying. Like, you know, we don't even need to debunk that at this point because you just did it. But I'm saying like, but yeah, you what you raised in your analysis is like you ask people, all right, what's your evidence? And then you usually get a response that it's something personal. And it's not to say that we're even on our show or even within your analysis that you're just completely dismissive of people's personal experience. That's factored in. But I think the point is to say that that cannot be the only way that we measure an entire population of people, or even if it's not talking about that specific topic, it cannot be the only way that we understand any particular phenomena. It's just based on our personal experience. So even with the stuff we were talking about earlier, the Willy Lynch letter, for instance, you can, that's what happened during slavery, or people will try to say, even though it's not a real letter, that it has some valid points, and I don't even agree with that. But again, like you were saying, we're going to take Black people seriously, then Black people deserve a rigorous, broken down, and a well analyzed and examined history of a situation if the goal is for any type of liberation. Now, if you just want something to hold on to feel better, that's fine. It's just like that's not what we're doing, is also fair to say. So some people, that's just what they want. They really just want stories that give them a sense of positivity and so forth about themselves, or just reinforce a particular reality that they've come to be comfortable with. And if that's where you stand, that's fine. But I'm just saying, like, that's not a rigorous analysis of society, of the world, of reality. That's just not what it is. And we just got to be honest about that. It's something we have to take seriously, and you can't just be, randomly making claims. And that's why we check myths, like, because it's like these things, again, have material impact. Like, if you walking around thinking Black men ain't shit, now and another thing I do want to say, just to be fair, like with some things, it's all context based too. So like, if Cameron's hanging out with the girls and niggas was on bullshit or whatever, somebody didn't do something and they're like, niggas ain't shit. Then nobody, it's like, we're not like policing this shit, right? So if you say that, we don't care. But don't make a whole paper and try to make this a breakdown of a community. Like, because, we all say things, in the company of our friends that, if applied in a larger scale would be terribly problematic. But in a group chat, I might say something like that, right? Because
there's a clear difference between what me and my girls talk about and bell hooks weaving in slander about Black men that has been widely distributed and creating a narrative that, and as somebody who has read some bell hooks quite a bit, and had to really do a lot of unlearning from that in the ways in which I navigate spaces and navigate relationships, and even my understanding of Black men for years, because that has material impact, right? And that had an impact on that book has sold millions and millions of copies. And so a lot of times, I think for years I've said, like, being woke is not fun. Regardless of how you feel about the word, or the more that we aim to fight and for liberation starts with political education, and it starts from doing a lot of unlearning. And unfortunately, that also requires a lot of reflection. You can't just sit here and say that you want Black people to be free if you don't understand what we're facing against, right? And so a part of learning just about the ways in which the world is set up to begin with will infuriate you. And then when you take it a step further and you are beginning to analyze our community, because we want to build community up, and you think about the ways in which we cause harm, or how we have allowed a lot of these ingrained messages to cause harm, and you do a lot of, and I think sometimes that's where that conflict becomes really deep and really heavy, is you have to do that reflective work. It's very easy to just collectively be like, oh, niggas not shit, they don't do blah, 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 without thinking of like, ooh, well, what do I do as an individual, as a Black woman, that makes someone feel neglected, that makes someone feel uncared? What am I doing by creating these messages as well? How is that impacting further generations if I just also have these ingrained thoughts and processes for myself? And that shit gets uncomfortable, but it's necessary. It is really necessary for us to constantly be challenging what we think we know, what we think is fact, what we think is truth. And when we get to that spot where you don't like the information you find out, you got to sit with it and create room for nuance. Like, and there's room for that. It is okay to, happily sit in something like Black Don't Crack. I thoroughly enjoy looking at Black women who are in like their 60s who look like me and get excited of thinking about the ways in which that as a Black woman, when I get old, I might still look like, a fine ting. But it's also imperative that I understand the ways in which that very same type of joy has been utilized for harm, right. and to be able to allow myself to sit in the nuance of both, so that way I can be able to continue to educate and uplift others to understand truth.
And I think really quick too, on this point of, it's one thing if we're just shooting the shit, barbershop, salon, it's Easter Sunday, right? It's another thing if we're leaders of organizations, right? Or we're saying, or we're determining who's the most vulnerable, right? When we use these words. So my thing is like, it's one thing if we shooting the shit, but if we're being serious about how do we build organizations, if we're being serious about how resources should be allocated, and we're using words, or we're leaders of organizations and we're using words like most, all the time, since time began, typically, usually, occasionally, I think if we're going to be using language like this and we're going to present ourselves as an authority on a given subject, you now have to sufficiently prove that kind of claim, right? So again, it's one thing if we just shooting the shit, right? But it's another thing if we're literally making claims about Black people or about how the world operates, and we cannot sufficiently prove the things that we say, and then these claims are what we are going to organize around, or these claims are going to inform a 10-point plan, or these claims are going to inform, who deserves what in an organization, or
and
who
I can get funding based off these ideas, right? Like that's, to your point, like it's not, and I think that's a great distinction. That's why I was trying to say a little bit earlier, like, you got to be able to have context. So like, if when we turn off record, we might say some shit that, if applied in a different context, might get us in trouble, but we know we're off record and we all friends, so it's different, right? But like, if I'm gonna get on camera and be like, this is the Black Miss podcast, and I'm gonna just say some bullshit, and I'm holding myself to a certain standard, I can't do that, right? So like you said, go ahead.
No, I even think like I'm an educator, and I'm now a school leader, and there are plenty of days that are rough, that are hard. And when I am not on the clock and I'm with friends, especially other educators, we will talk some shit and crack some jokes and, really let off some steam. But I will never step in my school building and allow anyone, staff or not, to perpetuate a narrative about kids, especially about our Black kids, and our Black boys that would ever cause harm, and I would not allow, and I will always challenge when things come up and folks are leaning into these very narratives that are harmful, when they're thinking about consequence ladders. I can't count how many times I've had someone send a kid to me, because something was wrong, and I walked through an incident with a kid, and there were so many things that they needed far before it got to that point. And then when I sit with a teacher, or a staff member or a parent sometimes, and I'm walking them back through that, and I'm asking, did you do this, this, and this? what was your thinking? And they're like, oh, well, they're just like that, or that's just how they are, boys will be boys. I'm like, no, like when we're not challenging these things, when we're not challenging our own thought process, and then we're not stepping in to challenge others, this continues on a cycle. And that's a lot of what our purpose as a pod is doing, is saying that these myths have continued to be allowed to thrive because no one has stopped to challenge it. And no one has stopped to then really break down and expose it for what it is. So that way we can move forward and be able to walk in truth.
So here we're just with Taharka. Cam had work to do at her job, so she had to get off the line. So we appreciate her contributions. So me and Taharka are going to continue to have a discussion. Again, people organize around these ideas, right? And they're not just ideas that are sitting around. So I think sometimes people might feel like, we're being harsh or something, or why y'all got to push back on that. It's like there are consequences. When we say material impact, we're saying there are consequences to this shit. Like, that's why we don't pick out things that don't have consequences, because it doesn't really matter at that point. But when you believe in shit, or you move on things, whether you believe in it or not, you move on these things because you think that's the most rational thing or whatever. Like, it has consequences particularly on us who are already at the bottom of society. So I just get tired of when people get mad, because it's very selfish for me when a whole group of people are being impacted, but you want to hold on to personal truth because it makes you feel better. I think that's a very selfish thing to do, right? I don't care what we're talking about. I think it's a very selfish thing, because that ultimately hurts folks. So I think we really need to, like you were saying earlier, question some of the things that we even feel like uplift us. Because I know a lot of the pushback we get from our show is that, particularly we got this on the Black Wall Street, and even stuff that's not even always like directly related to self-esteem. There's certain stuff that people's experiences taught them that this is the right way, and the facts don't mean shit to them. And it's just like, that's not the point. My experience, and I'm gonna hold on to that, and you're not gonna move me. And I don't really know sometimes how to deal with that. That's why we just make the case and move on, because I don't think you can pry people away from that just by saying that this is the logical way, because we know it's deeper than logic. We know there's trauma behind some of this stuff. There's different reasons why people hold on to beliefs that is very complicated. And our job is not to be therapists, right? Our job is to just make the argument and keep it moving, and you make your own choices. And I don't know if you feel like there's any other way of doing that, but I just feel like that's the best thing you can do, is like make the case. You can't pry people out of their positions. That's something they have to be able to do on their own, in my opinion.
Yeah, working with the African Black Coalition, for those who don't know, this is a statewide coalition of Black student unions throughout the California State University system and the University of California system. These are college systems. And working particularly in terms of doing political education with college students, and even outside of ABC, working with young people in schools, some of the ways I've got people to reevaluate what they believe is to present to them somebody saying something similar that they categorically disagree with. So for example, somebody may say something about Black youth or Black young people rebelling from the state, or Black young men or Black young women, that is disparaging them or is criminalizing them, and they'll be hell-bent on that position. Then I'll bring up something that Joe Biden said when he was pushing for past the crime bill, in 94?
Yeah, 94.
Or I'll pull up what Hillary Clinton said, right? Or I'll pull up what Bill Cosby said during his pound cake speech, right? Or I'll pull up what Barack Obama said, about Black fathers on Father's Day, right? And at least at that moment, sometimes that's for me, able to work as a strategy where I do a comparative analysis, right? So we'll have positions in the 21st century about Black people or about the world, and I'll bring up what white folks have said historically about Black people, and then basically I try to put people on a path of tracing intellectual genealogy, because like you said, to Black, ideas don't fall out of the sky, right?
No.
The notion that Black men respond to their oppression by brutalizing and terrorizing their communities, right, comes out of subculture of violence theory in like the 1960s and 1970s, right? And we could trace that back even further. So I try to do these comparative analyses to show Black people what white folks and what individuals who are in power of systems and institutions have done by using those same kinds of ideologies and perspectives that you have about Black people. Now, again, if we just shooting the shit, you know, sometimes we might say, oh, Black kids in this school be off the chain, or damn, no Black parents, you know, we don't see them at the back to school meetings. But if I'm gonna have a substantive and real conversation, I know that just leaving the comment of Black parents don't show up to back to school night as is obscures the fact that Black parents are working their asses off, right? Black parents have, you know, less access to childcare services, right? Black parents may have limited access to transportation, right? Black parents may have a history of experiencing violence in this school, right? So again, you know, this whole thing about, once again, it's okay to shoot the shit, but we have to be clear about, and I think we have to do, sometimes I think we have to do a better job of, you know, showing to our people. And I think this requires that some of us take it upon ourselves to do the historical work like the Black Myths podcast does, to show how these ideologies are being recycled in order to harm you as a Black person. And when I've been able to do that, it hasn't always worked, but at least I've been able to get Black people to confront what they believe in the 21st century, not based off of just Taharka's individual opinion, or I believe personally there's good Black men out here. It's like, no, let me show you how white folks are using this to incarcerate, criminalize, and kill Black people, right? Let me show you how doctors are using this to pretend like Black women are feigning illness or pretending to be in pain where they're not really in pain, right? Let me show you how this is, when we endorse these things, it does not always just remain in your community. If you endorse these things, it can and has and will be used in order to justify harm against Black people entirely, or harm against segments of the Black community that ultimately impacts, you know, Black people collectively at the end of the day. So, but you know, like you said, sometimes like what I've, you know, being that one of my focuses is Black male studies and the vulnerabilities of Black men, for me, talking to sisters about the vulnerabilities of Black men, sometimes I've had more success listening to what they've been through. Right now, should I have to should an individual have to listen to all of somebody's hurt and pain in order to get somebody to not wholesale indict a segment of the Black community that they belong to? Not necessarily, but I know that as a Black man, in order for me to figure out how to get, whether it's Black women or other Black people, to confront what they believe about Black men and boys, sometimes it's critical for me to understand how are you arriving at this
Right.
information? And then by understanding, you arrived at this because this is what you saw in your household. You arrived at this because you grew up in this particular kind of community. You arrived at this because you read this book that told you this is how Black men and boys arrive at their behavioral decisions. Now I'm able to develop, a strategy for how, like, now I'm able to develop or think through or get you to re-examine how we arrive at different things. But
right, and I mean, it's also just having a certain empathy for people, because I'm saying, to be fair, even the process we've been describing throughout this episode, we're not trained to think like this. Like, so I'm saying, even with the idea of being, like, I guess, for lack of a better word, scientific in your analysis and having some certain method and being conscious of your method and how you're evaluating things, it's not something that most of us are raised with at all. Like, we don't learn in school for the most part. There's nothing really in the dominant culture that reinforces that type of evaluation, particularly with social media, where narratives just take off, and we never question the premise of like we were talking about, the framing of things. The framing can take off and we don't even question it. So a lot of us, when we're dealing with our own individual struggles or our own pain, or just trying to understand the world in general, don't have these tools really at our right in front of us to again make an assessment of the situation. So we are gonna, naturally are gonna fall back on the things that are most, common to us, or the things that are most familiar, and those are our personal experiences, right? Like, that's what people do. And we always try to hold space for the fact that is a thing that people do, and we're not here to bash something or tell you you're stupid or you're an idiot, because I don't think that's productive at all either. Now some people are those things, but I'm just saying, like, in general, like, we don't want to just do that, with almost Black people, because we want to hold some type of love for Black people too, and some type of, like, appreciation and understanding of Black people. So I think it's fair, like you said, when you're talking to sisters or any Black person and you're trying to understand how they got there, their experiences are still valid. It doesn't mean that data can justify an explanation of an entire population, no. But their experiences still happen, and that still is part of the data, and that still is part of how they process things. We have to respect that, but that cannot become the just natural go-to. And then anything else that might be counter to their experience, or at least their experience explaining everything, we can't just completely dismiss that and just center experience. And I think that's what ends up happening, unfortunately, is there's not a balance of the approach. And it's just like, we're just going to center that experience, and then everything else is kind of out the door. And if you try to bring it up, then you might come off as a hater, or you are, an apologist of some type of harm, or I think it's complicated, but I think we have to be able to, like, promote a better analysis of what we're dealing with. And, because again, we're not taught these things, like, I had to learn this stuff. It just in the fly. So go ahead.
No, I agree. And I think, when growing up, if there's a certain point in time when, I would, be committed to certain types of ideas, and my dad would just pose to me, is there a possibility you are incorrect?
Right.
And I'll be like, no, there ain't no way, blah, blah, blah. And he would be like, is there a possibility, right? Is there a possibility there's another argument, right, that you may not know or that you may not understand, right? Or he would always teach me, study Black people and study Black history, but also study it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what happens, regardless if you are in some of our spaces, whether you're a Black communist, a Afro pessimist, a Pan-Africanist, a Black feminist, I think sometimes we are so committed to our field of thought or our way of organizing that we are no longer open to the critique or the exchange, right? So although I'm a Pan-Africanist, I want to, or although I may be in Black male studies per se, right? I still, at a certain point, like when I got into, I think I was like completing my master's degree, And although there were some things that I did not like about some segments of Black feminist scholarship, I committed myself to going and studying the expansiveness of Black feminist literature. And I ended up finding Black feminist scholars that that I agree with the things that they say and have a more rigorous citational practice, or I was at least able to find out the different ways in which Black feminist scholarship arrives at different conclusions about the world, about Black women's condition, about Black men. So I just always try to remind myself and remind other Black people that, you know, a part of rigorous analysis and I think organizing and being scholarly, and that's not just in a formal academic sense, is always being open to the exchange, right? Always being humble enough to reevaluate your position, always being humble enough to listen to what are the other arguments, right? Because even if you end up disagreeing with what the other interpretations or assessments may be, it can ultimately, I believe, just makes you more well-read or more well-versed in terms of having conversations about Black people, about white supremacy, about oppression and things like that. But I just think in you know, it's easy for us to arrive at certain positions in our different camps of thinking and just be like, you know, well, fuck that other camp, or you know, that's them feminazis. Oh, that's them Black women taking after the white feminists. And it's like, or, you know, that's them hotep niggas, right? And we disparage these different, or, you know, the civil rights wasn't, you know, civil rights movement, they was just about turning the other cheek and laying down and letting the white man sit on them. And, you know, and Black power, you know, what was powerful. And it's like, no, it's a lot more, like, if there's anything I've come to learn, is that it's a lot more nuanced, like Black people, Blackness, our condition, the way white supremacy operates is a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than sometimes we make it out to be. So I just try to commit myself to always being willing to lean into, you don't know every fucking thing. You just don't, right? And to always be open. I'm always open to the exchange, even if the other opinion is something I vehemently disagree with. I want to hear this, right? Because I want to know how you arrived at this. I want to know what you read or who you listened to or who you studied to arrive at this position, so that I can interrogate it to determine if I agree or to what extent I disagree.
No, that's real. Like, yeah, because we have to be open to those, like you said, open to the exchange, because that's how you learn. I mean, like, you have to. I know when I've written poems before and I'm trying to do like a satire of it or something, so I have to, like, I'm basically gonna say I'm gonna essentially make fun of the perspective. But what I always do, even if that's what I'm gonna do, is like I study that perspective, like, because I want to know it in and out. You know what I'm saying? So when I write the poem, even if you don't agree with me, like, you're like, all right, he at least represented that perspective fair, right? Like, and he then I tear it apart in my argument within the poem or whatever. But what I'm not gonna do, and I think this is what happens, kind of to your point, is people create a straw man, as in they create a false representation of something and then they argue that, and it's not actually what really went down. So if you're gonna just say, you know, well, Black feminists just want to be white women, well, you haven't really studied Black feminism if that's your entire analysis of Black feminism, because they have this discussion. And so it's always like this assumption that, you know, it's arrogant because you assume no one ever considered this until you randomly thought about it, right? You know, so it's like nobody in the field ever considered this. So you can argue that certain parts of Black feminism might be, you know, relatable to white feminism, or you can say I don't like the overall ideology, but do you know the overall ideology? You know, or are you just saying I don't like this particular representation of it because there are Black feminists who don't agree with bell hooks, right? He doesn't represent the entire field. So, and that goes for any. I'm just using that as an example. That goes for anything. You know, like, And Black people have always had these debates, had these arguments in much more sophisticated ways, I think, than we do today. But I'm just saying, like, we've had these discussions. Like, there's never been like I know the Black brunchers always like to say we're not a monolith, but I'm just saying, like, you know, ideologically as well, there's never been a monolith. But like, even when we were doing the thing on community control of the police and police abolition, you know, I was trying to just step in a few times in that discussion, because I think sometimes, you know, when the other representatives aren't there, it's easy to just kind of paint your opposition as being as something more simplistic than what it is. So it's like, even for abolition, abolitionists who don't agree with community control of the police, like, it's not that abolitionists have never considered what violence in the communities means and how we should respond to it. It's not just some fairy tale, you know, well, we're just gonna redistribute all the funds and get healthcare and jobs and everybody's just gonna stop hurting each other. Like, ain't nobody who takes it seriously saying that. so say if you want to disagree with it, fine, but you can't like turn that into the argument. I guess that's what I just get irritated about, is like, you have to be fair with what you're arguing. And it's tough because I think just naturally is, I don't know if it's naturally, but as humans, it's easy to want to make things a bit more simplified so you can approach it, right? But so you'll kind of reduce something to this, and it's just like, nah, like, if I'm gonna argue something is wrong, I need to know what I'm arguing. Otherwise, I'm just misrepresenting the argument, and I'm probably just perpetuating more myths.
I think I don't want people to, because I think sometimes I've heard like we do too much talking, or you know, this is a very, I think sometimes people pigeonhole this conversation that we're having in this realm of, this is just too intellectual and too academic, and this doesn't affect, you know, like, this don't affect real Black people on the ground. And I think and you could correct me if I'm wrong, I think in terms of investigating the myths, the Black Myths podcast investigates, in this conversation that we're having, I think we're specifically dealing with when those myths and when those ideas actually impact movement politics, which actually impact Black people on the ground, right?
Yeah. I mean, and not just movement politics, but just the general Black life. Like, again, like, I don't like that. That, I'm not talking about you, but that characterization that people make, where, you know, well, this isn't, you know, I think Rafiki Morris, I wrote this down. I didn't read it, but I'll read it now. He was giving a talk about culture, and he said, the people don't just need food, clothing, and shelter. The people also need ideas. The people need joy. The people need family and community and a vision for the future, right? So if you're just feeding people, and I'm not knocking, this is not directed at anyone, so I want to clarify that. I'm just saying in general, if you're just feeding people, at the end of the day, that's great. But that's still just a version of charity if those people don't have not just ideas like ideologically or politically, but if they don't have a culture that is producing a certain resistance to the system that is oppressing them, then they're always just going to end up back in that line to get fed. And it's not because of those individuals, but because it's us who are over those things aren't trying to produce anything better, so they don't have to keep coming back for food, right? And so it's like, so I can give you your food, but I also should, if you want to take it, you know, it's not about forcing it on people, but I also should be able to give you a certain level of education, political education, a certain level of joy and culture as well. Like, all of those things we should be able to give ourselves. It's not just about giving people food and shelter. Like, that's not how, again, ideas don't come from the sun or just from out of nowhere. So your ability to know how to read and assess the situation is incredibly important. And if you don't have the tools to do that, you know, then you often find yourself funneled back into the same bullshit. And then I don't just mean that individually, I mean that collectively, because I can individually have an analysis, but because I collectively don't have the support, I still can end up on bullshit, even if I know better. So that's why we have to collectively have that analysis so we can get ourselves further and get ourselves out of this shit. But you can't do that if your understanding is like we were talking about, that black boys ain't shit, so I'm just gonna beat the shit out of them. Like that, if that's your analysis of black boys, then you're not helping. You know what I'm saying? Like, so this isn't some intellectual thing. Like, this is stuff people do on a day-to-day that harms people, whether it's internally within the communities, whether it's, you know, on the structural level. Like this, you know, when people make policy decisions based on this logics, like this shit has real material impact. So I reject this idea that this is just intellectual fodder or whatever, or that anytime you're not putting food in somebody's mouth, you're just bullshitting. Like, I don't agree with that narrative. I see that on Twitter a lot. I never have addressed it, but this was one time I really just, you kind of set me up. I just wanted to speak to that because I'm just tired of that logic. That doesn't make any sense. And if you talk to anybody who actually deals with folks on the ground, they are always trying to produce a bigger program beyond just food anyway.
Right, and I think that's a great example you brought up. Like, and it reminds me of when the African Black Coalition, when we would go out to give hygiene kits and food to our houseless family on Skid Row, we made it a point to not just go out there and give stuff out, but talk to our students, right? Because some of our students may have this belief that we're the college educated ones that made good decisions, and this is why I'm not out here, right? So we made it a point to, yes, we're gonna pass out this food and stuff, but you also got to get some political education so that we can have a conversation around how does the city and how does the state and how does the government and how do exploitative systems of, well, capitalism is inherently exploitive, but how do system structures and institutions create the conditions so that our people disproportionately end up out here, right? So that our students are not believing, you know, I could just go plant trees in the hood because, you know, just because Black people don't care about the environment, that's why their community don't got trees. Or you know, if I just take a little bit of money out of my check and we just go give money to the homeless. No, we don't want to. Ultimately, if the goal is to eradicate, if the goal is to produce a situation where our people are no longer in that condition, we have to begin talking about what is the system and structure that put them there, right? Because like you said, this is not about being philanthropists and charity workers or some damn missionaries, right? That go and help the downtrodden, you know, of the race, or the Black people that didn't make good decisions, or the Black people that just don't want to fill out job applications. No, there's a larger system and structure that put them in that condition. So it's not just good enough for us to go feed them. We also have to organize collectively to confront governments or develop mutual aid societies, or to confront a system of capitalist exploitation that put them in that condition. So, you know, I think as you're saying, there has to be, well, I think for all of our most thorough organizers and activists, they always understood there's a connection between meeting the material need and the political education, right? So it's like that clip of, you know, the chairman Fred Hampton and the brothers came and was saying, like, I think they wanted to start like some kind of credit union or something like that, Black people to get money. And Chairman Fred was like, you know, where's the rest of the political education, brother?
There's no educational program here? That's come out of the socialization thing. You know, you set that up, brother. I mean, we can't put everything on one piece of paper.
What about this bank?
Credit union? Credit union. Credit union, my brother.
Is a bank.
Are you hip to credit unions? It is a bank.
Yeah, you go and borrow money?
Yeah, it's a bank. It's a bank. Owned by the people, run for the people, and by the people.
What will money be given out to people for?
Well, the people would decide that. You want to buy, you know, whatever, you know, the people in the community decide. You need some living room furniture, maybe? You need a car, maybe?
See, the thing is with me, you dig, I need to know some more about it. I wish you had some more literature about the educational thing here. Because, you dig, as far as we're concerned in the struggle, the way we look at struggle is that this depends on the educational thing, you dig. Because
this depends on the education. Well, the whole thing.
No, but in the end, this does. You can form this with no education. You can form this.
No, not the way we're talking about forming it. You know, right. We're talking about forming it right. You know, it's not on the paper. We didn't write it on the paper.
Form it right with no education.
No.
Let me give you an example. Jomo Kenyatta formed the excellent revolution with no education. And on the end thing, Jomo told the motherfucker, I said, well, you know, you can educate, hate the enemy, but I'm your brother. I'll help you lead the revolution. Now I'm going to oppress you. Another example, Papa Doc in Haiti. Papa Doc in Haiti hated everything white. Man, you couldn't put this white paper in front of Papa Doc's face. But he moved all the white people out and he took over and be oppressed. He did, because of no education. And the people that had been educated, they just said that we don't hate the motherfucking white people, we hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to know the educational program to find out what it's going to be in the finale. So we got to understand here the educational program that you have to be able to figure out whether it will go on the right lines, where the people will end up in a situation where they can be able to really control themselves. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, the people that take this local foundation and start stealing money because they won't be really educated to why it's the people's thing anyway. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, you have neo-colonialism instead of colonialism, like you got in Africa 9, like you got in Haiti.
He wasn't pathologizing the people, but the chairman was being honest about some of our people need political education to understand, you know, what to do with this resource that they will be provided. So I think it's the dichotomy that's sometimes created between boots on the ground organizing and these academic intellectual Negroes needs to be eradicated, because both of them inform, you know, one another.
Yeah, like you can't. Yeah, I stay out of that on, you know, online, because it just, I don't think most of it is worth even engaging. Right. But I'm just saying, like, there are people who are out of touch, right? Like we know that. And I would even argue, I think everybody likes to say, well, we talk about it, you know, it's not all about academics and all, but I feel like the centering of even complaining about academics perpetuates the conversation about academics all the time. That's why I just stay out of them. Like, well, y'all still talking about academia, even if you're bashing them, you're still mainly talking about academia all the time. So like, okay, if that's not, if they're out of touch, then just move on. But like the methodology of understanding and researching a subject matter, whether that comes from the hood, from the academy, wherever that comes from, like that's still necessary, right? So the function that is served by somebody who can understand a subject on a deep level is still a necessary function. It does not have to come from an academic at a college. It's just unfortunately that in this society, they're privileged with the time and the resources to do that job that a lot of us don't have on the outside of the academy. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, etc. But that function is what matters at the end of the day, no matter who's doing it. So we still need a function. We still need somebody who can analyze situations and give people information, because everybody does not have time to dig deep into every subject matter. They have other things to do. And that's why you specialize certain jobs like you do in any other version of the economy. Everybody doesn't have time to farm, so somebody else does it, so you can just buy this shit at the store. It's no different with the intellectual stuff. Like somebody has to analyze and scientifically break it down so you can have an idea of how to move, because we all take some idea in this world to understand how to do a situation. Nobody just makes shit up out of the blue. There are already ideas lying around anyway that we're going to access to do something. That's how life works. So any idea or anybody that wants to act like you just make shit up out of your head, that's just not what happens. Like you don't do that ever, right? Like we say there's no such thing as self-made, because something preceded you coming to that conclusion. A series of phenomena, something preceded you doing it. We don't just do this podcast because we thought it was a good idea. After years of watching bullshit constantly be perpetuated, you know, that actually inspires an idea to do something like this. If there was no bullshit, this podcast wouldn't be needed, right? We wouldn't even do it. So I'm saying, like, that's just how life works. So it's just crazy to me when people act like you can just pluck shit out. We just gonna do it. It's like, no. So like I said, everyone has a methodology. Correct. Everybody does. Even children. Everybody has some methodology. You may not know you do, but you have a series of ways that you do things and you get them done. We all have one. So you don't have to use that word. So it's not an intellectual thing. There's nothing you can do. If you want to go to the store, you have a method of doing that. If you have a car, you get in a car. If you take the bus, if you take the Uber, that is a methodology. It's not some highfalutin concept. It's just like, If you want to understand something, you say you Google it or you call somebody. You have a methodology to receiving information. It's a very simple thing that we all do. We're just saying we are showing you what we privilege when we have it within our methodology. That's all we're saying. But this idea that you can escape that, it's like, no, things are material. This is how the world actually works. You can't be outside of that. So I don't know. You kind of got me hyped, man. But I'm just saying, like, yeah, I think we got to really understand. I hate when we divorce in a fair critique to push back on people who are over intellectualized stuff and who are highfalutin and smug. Sometimes we end up bashing the wrong things within that, because it's like, nah, niggas still need to have some intellectual and just practical understanding of how things work. And you don't need to bash that part, just deal with the individuals. Because a lot of times the issue with these academics is they're not doing the very things we're talking about. They're not using any rigorous tests. They're not explaining things in fair ways. They're not relatable. They don't break shit down. They don't do their job, right? Like that's they're not doing that for people. So separate that from the actual thing. Like that's, yeah.
No, I think that's critical. And like one of the main nuggets I'm pulling from what you just said is like, everyone has a method and everyone has biases that influence their method, right? And, not only do I understand that from being outside of the academy, but one of the things I've been really, was really able to interrogate during my first year of my doctoral program is like, I have different peers in my classes. Some are in the humanities, so they're like English majors, creative writing, literature, performance studies. Then there's some people who are social scientists, so it's like sociologists, psychologists, so forth and so on. Then there's some people in my classes who are like studying to be they're like in the quote unquote hard sciences, right? And one thing that we were able to pick apart in our classes is that none of these ways of thinking are objective, right? Because it's like sometimes people will be like, well, being that quantitative methods have been used in a racist fashion or a gendered fashion to oppress people, the anecdotal evidence is more valid, off rip. And it's like, no. Even in anthropological methods, there's racism, right? There's xenophobia, there's classism, right? Or even we could swing to the hard, quote unquote, hard objective sciences. These people was using scientific method to say Black people's blood coagulates faster, right? That Black people, have smaller lung capacities, that Black people have smaller skulls and therefore they got smaller brains and therefore they're stupider, not as smart as white folks. So I think what those things allowed me, as you're bringing up, allowed me to confront and really interrogate from reading across these different fields is that everybody has a method and everybody has biases and blind spots that inform the way they arrive at different things. Mm-hmm. And what our responsibility is to investigate, well, what is your method? Did you arrive at this based off of examining a poem? Did you arrive at this based off of observing a human population? Did you arrive at this based on some faulty 23andMe blood samples or something like that? But all of them, right, have a method that warrants investigation, and none of them are free. None of them are above, examination or just true just because we say they are.
No, and it knocks you off your superior horse when you have to accept that, right? Like when no matter what you claim, you can still be about whatever you claim, but you have to accept that I don't have some exceptional truth about the world. I might have what I think is the best analysis of it. If you're a communist, you might think that's the best analysis of it. And I'm probably not even going to disagree with you for the most part. But I'm just saying, like, there's always like relationships that we enter into that can keep teaching us about stuff. Nothing is static. And it just annoys me when people act like, I have this exceptional view and nobody else has it. And it's actually understanding that you can't have an exceptional view that I think bolsters the best analysis, right? But you're always privileging something.
Right.
And that's even the problem with the way liberal society works, is it teaches you can just flatten things and nothing gets privileged. You're always privileging something. So we can privilege the fact that we're going to take care of everybody's daily needs before we privilege profits, or we can abolish profits, but we're always privileging something. So like even privilege in and of itself gets mystified as just like they have privilege. It's all right to privilege certain things. If you privilege, I don't know, your kid eating over you, I don't want you to have to make that choice. But if that's the position that you're in, right? Like, I think that's a fair choice. You don't want your kid to die, so you're going to feed your child. You're always privileging something, like depending on a given situation. And that's how we arrive at a methodology. And the methodologies aren't static either. Like we might do this show 2 years later and feel like we got to add something else because we realize there's a hole in what we did, right? So it's not like, oh, this is just the best way. It's like, no, this is how we chose to evaluate things and have some objective understanding, or not even like you said, not objective, but have some like concluded view of how we're going to look at it. And people can pick it apart. But I would argue, I don't even feel like most people have a clear methodology of how they do things. And I think that's why things are often confused and you don't know where people are going and they're back and forth, because the methodology is just kind of whatever pops in the moment. And, you know, one moment we support this, the next moment, like you said, when you talk to people, you bring up a different example that's based on the same premise and they don't want to touch it because it's just the methodologies. All methodologies are flawed, including ours. But I'm saying like theirs are extremely flawed. So there's no consistency, you know? So it's just like, and you see this in how people function. Like you see this in how people like analyze things in this world. So there's no consistency. So like one level is, Black Lives Matter, whoop-de-whoop, whatever. Like you'll say that that's your major premise, right? But then in a minor premise, when it comes to a particular type of Black people, then they don't matter all of a sudden. Right. You know, so that's inconsistent. That's a terrible methodology, right? So I'm just saying, like, we could do it all day, but I'm just saying, like, I think it's how we already function. All we're doing is naming it. Like, that's it. But we are already doing this. This episode is not a discovery. You know, this is not a and most things aren't discoveries. It's observations that might get put down on paper or filmed. But things were already happening. If you don't discover gravity, right? Gravity is already happening. You know, Kwame Ture talked about, even when talking about Marx, he was like, Marx didn't discover or invent anything. He just made an observation, you know, similar to how Isaac Newton made an observation, or anyone who understands the law of nature makes an observation. So we are just making observations about a world that's already happening. We're not introducing anything new into it. We might be introducing a new way of conceptualizing it, but it's already happening. And we're just studying it like anyone. And we're all doing that, is my point. To the lowest level, to the child who's 1 year old, who's playing with toys, we're all looking at the world and trying to understand and make observations and come to different conclusions. We're all doing that. I just want that to be clear so people don't walk away thinking that this is just something that smart niggas do. No. You do it too. Right. Even if you think you're the stupidest person on the planet, you do it too. And you know what I'm saying? Like, we all do it. And that's just, so we just need to be conscious of the fact that we're doing it so we can improve it, because the system that we're up against is doing this as well. And they're doing it in a very fine-tuned way to keep you in a certain position. So I'm gonna close on that because like clearly this one got me going. But thanks for being here. I hope people learn something. I think that this is an important discussion to have, because I think not just to defend our show or anything, but I think it is important for people to think this type of thing through, because it's just often things are just assumed in our everyday lives, and it's important. Like the goal of our show is to interject in those moments and be like, well, did you consider and is that right? Because we all operate on certain myths individually, structurally, et cetera. So thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm tryna eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.